we came up with this list of 10 responsibilities for nonprofit corporations, and this is from the National Center for Nonprofit Boards. The first is determine the organization's mission and purpose. By the way, can everyone see it in back? All right. Next is select board members and executive director. Third, support the executive director review performance. Ensure effective organizational planning. Ensure adequate resources, which means fundraising. Manage resources effectively. Determine and monitor the organization's programs. Enhance the organization's public image. Serve as a court of appeals. And then assess the board's performance. So we're going to kind of wrap our conversation around this. And this may be something you want to share. Again, this is from the National Center for Nonprofit Boards, and it's a very good framework. So let's get started. And first question is basically, gentlemen, what is the best method?
Jeff, before we get going, I just wanted to interject a thought. And very early in my involvement with the museum, I really began to learn what is a nonprofit, what is a 501c3, and it occurred to me that there is a lot of different ways to add value to the community and not necessarily have to become a nonprofit. There are lots of programs that could add value. There's opportunities to add value by joining with other already existing nonprofits. So I just throw that out there to say, there are lots of different ways that people who want to make a difference in the community can without just automatically assuming they have to set up a nonprofit.
So in essence, some nonprofits probably shouldn't be nonprofits.
Perhaps.
Yeah, because actually a number of nonprofits, believe it or not, 35% of the nonprofits in this country have budgets of less than $25,000. So imagine trying to run a nonprofit board, staff, whatever you may have, or provide services on a small budget. So point well taken. But back to that original point, determining the organization's mission and purpose. Are there different stages? I mean, how do you begin to do that?
Well, it's sort of interesting, my thoughts on it. A not-for-profit business is a business. And businesses go through a particular life cycle. There are the startup businesses, the rapid growth businesses, the plateau, where everything is relatively stable. There are businesses that are in crisis. There are businesses that are very strong. So you really, as you're thinking of your not-for-profit, what stage are you in? What stage are you in? Are you an independent, small, entrepreneurial, growing nonprofit? And because this has a great impact on what kind of board you need, what resources you need, and as we're getting into a little more governmental control of reporting, what kind of accounting needs do you have? There are a lot of demands on non-profit organizations, but you have to think of yourself as a business. How can you be an efficient business? And where are you? Are you a branch of a national organization? Are you an independent organization? All these things are critical in determining what kind of leadership on the board you need, what kind of management leadership you need. So you have to analyze yourself. None of you are the same. You're different. And I think that's something that you have to take away. We're all for a certain goal, but we're all separate individual organizations.
Well, that kind of leads into point number 2. In fact, I've put this PowerPoint into 2 sections of 5, maybe a little bit easier to read in the back.
I had an experience in which one of my trustees, one of my board members, said to me during one of the conversations, which I'll describe to you later, he said, "Don, you're running this place too much like a business." He said, "You've got a bunch of 70-year-olds on the board, and we don't want to work this hard. We're volunteers." And I said, "Well, okay, I understand what you're saying, but we have an $8 million budget. We have 30 families that depend on us for full-time support. we have a 56-year-long history to support, and it would seem to me that we have a fiduciary responsibility to run this place like a business.
Well, let's talk about the different phases. There's startup, there's growth, there's stable. What would be the difference between the board and the director you might have at any of these phases?
Well, when I first got involved with the museum, we were pretty close to crisis mode. It was 5 years ago. Financially, we were struggling, as most nonprofits were at that time, and so that requires a certain kind of leadership that is going to bring stability to the organization. The organization was ready for change. It knew it needed to change, and that created an opportunity. I think when you start looking at an organization, for me, because I had a consulting background, I kind of had my toolkit. I knew kind of things that I needed to do that should get done. But more importantly, you have to really understand the context of the organization, not just what has to be done, but what are all the external factors that you have to consider, because, as Martin said, every organization is different. So you have to learn, what is happening in the economy, what is happening in our community, what is happening with our membership base, what are the demographics that we're going to need to rely on in the future. And all that needs to be taken into consideration before you come up with your plan of action of, okay, now what am I going to do on day one?
Well, is there a different type of board for that kind of situation versus a place like the Straz Center for the Performing Arts, a stable organization?
Sure.
What would be some of the differences in the board members you'd want? Mark?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting. This year we have a $34 million budget. We have 125 to 130 full-time employees. And to give you an example of the kind of board members you need, one, you need dedicated, hard-working, interested board members. They're interested in the performing arts, or they wouldn't be on your board. So I had 2 meetings yesterday. To give you an example, I had a meeting of our HR committee, and on that committee, the board members included a bank president, a former bank leader who managed 3,200 people, and I had an owner of a business with 200, 250 employees. And they were sitting there, and we were talking about HR issues, about diversity challenges and how do we adjust to them, about retirement plans and what kind of plan is best for our people. So those are the kind of board members I meet. Our next meeting was our executive committee of the board. There we had 2 attorneys. We had a leader of one of the large accounting firms in town. We had a banker. We had a representative of the county. We had a representative of the city. And we had the leader of our building committee. So these are interested, excited people who are in a complex organization. Our organization is committee-driven. The committees have power. They make recommendations. We question them. Then they go to board. But it's totally different than a smaller organization. It's not better. It's different.
Well, let's talk about recruiting board members. Who do you want? Should a board member's contributions be an important element of them being on your board? Don?
Certainly, some level of contribution for board member status needs to be established. But in my opinion, the criteria is whether the board member is generous within his own ability to be generous. I would certainly hate to think that I had to get rid of all of my board members who hadn't given us $25,000 this year. On the other hand, in our case, we do have a $5,000 threshold. But I would contrast our situation with yours, Martin, in that we're a much smaller organization and we are program driven even in the board. And we need board members who have skills in being involved, working, progressing in the programs that our organization runs. Our board comes already from a group of people who are intimately involved with our organization and who are anxious to be involved on a day-to-day basis with staff members in the creation of our programming.
Well, bringing new board members on is always the great challenge. And how do you approach people you may want to have, but you don't know those folks, but you want them, you believe you want them on your board?
Well, I have to give you my reaction to that. I'm not so sure about how to approach them. I do know how not to approach them. I will tell you that in a period of several months, we had a situation arise in which two potential board candidates were essentially promised board membership by someone who did not have the authority to promise them this membership. And when it came to the governance committee to decide, the governance committee did not decide to recommend these people. All I can tell you is you do not want to allow that situation to start. You must find a way not to create expectations in the minds of the people that you're discussing this with.
Is it possible to try out board members? Is there some way to do that?
Well, I think going back to an earlier comment, I think you have to take the context of where the organization is, and then you have to decide what is the best governance model to accomplish the objectives of the organization. In my case, when I took over, we had a very large board, 50, 60 people. We were in pretty crisis mode, and I realized, that was not the right model. I was not going to get 60 people to agree on what to do next. We needed to be much more nimble. So we reduced the board significantly. And that's where leadership comes in. That was not necessarily the most popular decision I ever made, but it's what the organization needed. So we reduced the board to 20. We had 20 hard-working people that were committed. At that time, I didn't ask people to make a financial contribution because I needed smart people, dedicated people to make some tough decisions. As we've matured and as we've gotten much more stable and healthy, we are now looking for different board members. We're looking for much more diversity. We are looking for people who can contribute. So you have to take a long perspective, long-term perspective on what you want to accomplish. Probably getting your first diverse person on your board is the hardest, but that opens up opportunities to bring more diversity on your board. So you really have to take a look at, where are you and what you want to accomplish, and then what's the right governance model, number of people, skill set to help get you there.
I think one of the other things is there some clever way that you can see whether a person would be good on the board, wants to be on the board, and would contribute as board members. So about a year and a half ago, I tried something that actually worked, and I asked my vice chairman to set up a group of non-board members, community activist leaders in a variety of areas. And I said, we really ought to look at our future here at the Straz. We've been actively open a little over 25 years. What's the next 25 look like? So why don't you pull together a group? And he did this, and out of this group of maybe 15, he approached 7 or 8, decided, yeah, I'd like to do that. Well, that required them to come to meetings, about 7 or 8 meetings that were an hour or 2 in length, spaced over a few months, come up with a plan for the future of the Straz. Well, the fascinating thing is, of those people who came, they all actively participated. They weren't passively sitting back. They were thinking, what can we do to make this a better place? Of those, 3 of them now will be joining the board. because one, we test drove them. We said, hey, do you really care? Do you care enough to show up? One. Do you care enough to participate? Two. And come up with a real vision of what the Straz should look like in the next 10, 25 years. And out of that, we recruited 3 wonderful new board members, and we know they're interested. They've proven that. We know that they are idea people, which is another board member attribute that's really critical. So there are different ways you can do it. All groups, all committees, all organizations can try something different. You don't have to be a member of the board to be on a committee. So appoint someone to a committee. Do they show up? Do they participate? Are they helpful? Hey, that person might be a good board member.
Well, these are good points. We're good, as you can see, we're on number 2 of a list of 10. So we're about halfway through our presentation. We're going to step it up. But there are some things we're not going to dwell on a lot. But I know there are things like fundraising, governance, communication within staff and board. Those are things we're going to really drill down on. Let's move to that. Support of the executive director and performance review. Now, I think, Don, it was you who said that in our group that the board chair is the gateway to the board, and the executive director is the gateway to the staff. Among the 3 of you, what's the effective method for communicating between the executive director and the chair, as well as the board and the staff? And this can be a challenge.
I think that the answer to that question is as varied as the personalities that you are dealing with. I think I just can tell you that in my particular case, I thought we needed a rather tight ship in this area. I made it clear that I thought that the board chair was the gateway to the board and that the executive director was the gateway to the staff. We know, of course, there's going to be a lot of commerce between the staff and the board, but I insisted that both the executive director and I be copied on emails and at least know generally what kind of action was taking place. I think that we have seen this kind of get away from us at times, and we had a rather disorganized situation. I think that my feeling is you can relax this kind of control a lot easier than you can create this kind of control.
I agree with that, and I think it's as varied as the personalities you're dealing with. I had the opportunity to work with 2 executive directors. We communicated very differently. With one, I felt I needed to be at the museum on a regular basis to be accessible. And with my current fabulous executive director, we set up calls and we know when it's right to speak, and we just work off the assumption there's no surprises to either one of us.
Yeah, it was relatively easy for me because I was working with Judy Lisi, so this wasn't the big issue. You know, the organization was well run. She always communicates with me when a problem comes up, and problems do come up. And so we're in the same team, and we are more informal in our working relationship than formal, as Don was. Yeah. And I think it's how you and the executive director work is largely based on your personality and his or her personality. And you just always want to be ahead of the game.
I think it's very interesting that both Don and I had, during our 10 years as board chair, we had for a period of time to step in and be the executive director. And should that situation occur, either someone resigns or moves on or is no longer in the position, it becomes the board chair's problem to solve. And very often it's solved by the board chair stepping up and stepping into that role. I had to do that for about 10 months. It was extraordinary eye-opening for me to see how the organization actually works, and it makes me appreciate the role of the executive director in a way that I never did. But having a strong executive director it makes your life, very, very different, very easy, as opposed to not having one. So the time that the board chair spends on developing, selecting, nurturing, making sure your executive director is getting value back from their position pays you back many, many times.
Now, you actually brought a consultant in to work with your executive director.
We couldn't afford to actually go and hire a search firm. I wish we could have, but we didn't. So we took we tried to do as much as we could on our own, but we did hire an outside consultant to help us make our final decisions, and that was extraordinarily valuable. I was concerned that what happens if the search committee didn't necessarily agree on one candidate. I didn't want to create division among the board as to who the candidate should be. And as you know, we're a relatively small town, and people made all kinds of recommendations as to who they thought the next executive director should be, whether they were qualified or not. And it was quite honestly, it was very nice to say, well, the consultant didn't like that person, and I got it off my back. But it is helpful to have that objective point of view. And our consultant uncovered things that we never would have uncovered in the process. And we're committed to our executive director becoming stronger and stronger. And she has a budget to get that kind of support during her onboarding and just career development. I think it's critical that the executive director continues to grow and challenges the staff to continue to grow and develop.
We're going to move on now to the ensuring effective organizational planning, which is governance. And this is one area that all three of us in our discussions and planning for this kept coming back to governance, because governance is like the central nervous system of a nonprofit organization. And if the governance isn't right, something's going to short circuit along the way. And good governance is really the foundation of an effective and engaged board. And by governance, you may mean different things to different people, but in essence, in our discussions, it meant the bylaws, the committees, board recruiting, orientation, succession, and performance evaluation. So the question, I guess, is this, Marty, this is something you brought up, is that you should let your bylaws work for you.
Well, as I mentioned in my intro, I knew nothing about nonprofits. I knew nothing about how boards are run. I knew nothing about Robert's Rules of Order. And in preparing myself for the role, I called our legal advisor at the time, and he gave me the best piece of advice. He said, let your bylaws work for you. Don't feel you have to be constrained by them. And that really was a great piece of advice, because with that, we rewrote our bylaws. We realized that our bylaws, we were following them, but they were written at a time when we were in a different stage. As an example, we had a clause in our bylaw that if you were a Holocaust survivor, you would be allowed on the board and you had no term limit. Well, when the bylaws were written, most of the survivors were in their 50s and 60s. 20 years later, do the math. It was no longer working for us. And so we had to rewrite those. And again, tough decisions, but we had to get it right. And the bylaws should be looked at on a periodic basis, make sure they're still relevant, and make changes to them.
Now, one of the things that boards do somewhat differently, some of them determine what role board members will play, staff will play based on bylaws. And some of them, in terms of board members particularly, use contracts.
When we bring on a new board member, that board member has been screened, if you will, by the governance committee. And when a recommendation is made, it's after a careful screening. That person then is told what the expectations are, what the role he or she will play on the board is, and then are oriented as to the organization itself. And I think that's quite valuable. One other thing that bylaws do in the governance area, it allows you to get out of trouble. It was funny, the other day I was telling Jeff, I was having a lovely day off bicycling over in Davis Islands, and I saw a friend of mine and stopped to say hello, and he's the chairman of the board of a organization down in Sarasota. And he said, have you ever had this problem? The problem is I have a very disruptive board member. That board member is abusive to the executive director, not really abusive, but always critical. That board member is critical of all the other board members, and I don't know how to handle it. And I was thinking, I said, well, how long are your terms? He said, well, we have 4-year terms. He said, how long has this member been a member of the board? 3 years. I said, thank her for her contributions. And at the end of her 4th year, she goes off the board. Have you had other members go off the board? Oh, yes. I said, well, you're not. This isn't new territory. That's one reason that you have governance, so you can handle difficult issues. And this issue is relatively straightforward. She won't be happy. Well, you know, that's life. I did ask if she was a major contributor. And the, I mean, let's face it, we're all practical. And he said, no, not particularly. He said, good, you know. So that's one of the things that governance structure can do.
Right. And
I have a question for Don. Don, in your opinion, what's the board chair's role in monitoring and coaching board members?
Well, I thought you'd never ask. Sort of my key issue. I'm sort of a one-issue candidate on this subject. I actually think that the effectiveness of a board is very dependent upon the board members themselves all feeling empowered. I believe that the only way that you can get a board to work hard, to be on the job, and to be thinking creatively is if each one of them feels that he is an important part of the process. When I began my term as a board chair, we had a long simmering, serious controversy that erupted, I guess, the day after I took my job as chair. It was serious enough that it appeared to me that it might actually split our board down the middle. Now, you could approach this sort of problem in a number of ways. I'm much more of a collaborator than I guess I would say that being a codependent person rather than a field marshal type person, my approach to this was to begin meeting with my individual trustees one at a time as quickly as possible. I was new in the job and I wanted to know their thoughts about the organization in general. So I started arranging one-on-one conversations with them, asking their opinions, listening, acting almost, if you will, as a therapist, getting them to tell me everything that they would tell me about their association with the organization, about their experiences on the board, whether they thought we were headed in the right direction, what they had been disappointed about, what they'd been proud of. And after I had listened to these people tell me this, I then began to share with them some of my ideas in the same vein and to give them some of the goals that I had for going forward with the organization. Opportunities for board members to learn that they are important and to hear that directly from the board chair and I think from the executive director also are very, very important. They, in my judgment, become enabled. Here's what happened as a result of that series of meetings. Number one, many old grudges between the board members went away. We had people who didn't think they could get along because they just hadn't liked each other forever and didn't think that they agreed on anything. Found out when they had this shared experience with me and with other board members, they found out that simply because one of them was a liberal and one was a conservative didn't mean that they couldn't work for the benefit of the organization. The second thing that happened was a spirit of compromise developed. If people believe that they have been heard and taken seriously and their opinions are valued, I believe that they are more willing to compromise and cooperate. The third thing that happened was that in the subsequent 2 years of my term, there was not one single unexplained absence from a board meeting of any board member. They wanted to be there. They wanted to do their job. They felt important. And the last thing that I noted that I attribute to that is that every single vote that we took on our board for the next 2 years was a unanimous decision. That does not mean that everybody agreed with everything that we did. It does mean that they thought they had been heard, and they had heard other people, and they were more interested in getting the job done than getting their own way. So I believe that the key is that every board member must know that he's important to the chair and to the organization, and I call it empowering the board member.
We have a little bit of time left, and there's no way we're going to end this discussion without touching upon fundraising, because I know a few people in the audience think about fundraising quite a lot. So number 5 is ensuring adequate resources, and that, in the end of the day, is raising the funds necessary. And I think everyone would agree that a good development staff and a development plan are a blessing, and they are absolutely a necessity. So, Martin, I'll ask you, is fundraising an executive director and a staff responsibility, or is it a board responsibility?
The answer is yes. It's both. Some people have a great deal of difficulty asking for money. They will give money, but they can't ask for money. And that's fine. Everyone's role on the board varies, but it's very hard to get people to ask for money. That's very, very difficult. But I learned something one day. I was out soliciting someone for a small donation to a large national organization, and he said, "Oh, by the way, are you still on the board down at Tampa Bay Performing Arts Center at that time?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, you know, I think my wife might enjoy being on that." And I said, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you and your wife come on down, and Judy and I will show you around, and we'll have lunch and see if she would like to, because we only want her because she wants to be on the board, not because you think it's good for her." So we sat down and had a very nice meeting and a very nice lunch. And this gentleman said to me, "Are there any donor opportunities?" Well, you know, I flew out of my seat. I grabbed someone and said, "Yes, there are. There are all kinds, whatever you want." And he said, "Well, what about that? Theater." I said, "Well, that's already designated. That was $1 million, and TICO is sponsoring it." And he said, "Well, what about this other opportunity?" And I said, "Well, that's a $5 million opportunity, and we certainly would love you to do it." And he said, "Well, you know, I think I'll do that." And so Judy and I walked them to we actually carried them to their car. We didn't walk them, we carried them.
And you won't share the name.
And, and we walked back in, and she said, "Are you believing that?" And I said, "Judy, I'm going to let him off the hook tomorrow because I want to be sure that he really wants to do this." And I called him. He said, "Oh, yeah, just send me a piece of paper." And so I sent him 2 lines, and he signed. The point of that is open your ears. Open your ears. Because people, whether you know it or not, sort of know what you do. It's a small community, as you pointed out. And if you're on the board of the Sarasota Opera and someone says, "Oh, gee, tell me a little more about that," you got the signal. You heard it. You opened your ears, and then you go forward. This was a fluke because it was such a large gift, but it wasn't a fluke because, for some reason or other, I actually listened to him. And so listen. Don't just talk. Listen. And you'll get a lot of feedback that will allow you to raise a good deal of money.
Well, as you pointed out, a lot of board members aren't comfortable with that. Any thoughts on how to get board members comfortable with fundraising?
Well, I think the board has a responsibility when they approve the budget to make sure that that budget is realistic and that budget is achieved. And if there are assumptions about board behavior built into that budget, I think it's critical that they fulfill those obligations. But as you said, a lot of board members would just write a check rather than ask. And what we've asked our board members to do is to host small events at the museum, bring in some friends, just cover the cost of the lunch, whatever you want to do, and let what happens happen. And we're trying to encourage that kind of behavior. It's very non-threatening. Invite your group of friends. We'll take it over from there, give them a tour, whatever they want. And coming out of that, you'll get a few more members. You'll get a few more checks. And that's good, too. And it makes the board member feel that they really are contributing and fulfilling their responsibilities.
Martin is absolutely right. The idea of having to raise funds strikes terror into even board members' hearts, I think, and we have realized that. And have gone through a recent program of trying to come up with a program a plan that would give our board members more comfort in this area. We decided that the first thing that needed to be done is that every board member needed to be able to tell the story of what we are about. He needed to be ready, prepared, rehearsed to do this. We actually had a board retreat, which we dedicated to the idea that we would help each board member rehearse his own 30-second elevator speech, which you know is the attempt to be able to tell the story of your organization in 30 seconds as you go from the first to the 8th floor on an elevator with someone. We believe that being able to tell the story comfortably was basically the common denominator. Beyond that, people could engage in areas that they were comfortable in, hosting events, etc., or going out and speaking to a large, wealthy philanthropist and asking for money. It all, to me, falls back again on enabling the board members, empowering the board members to do their jobs, giving them reason to be comfortable, giving them reason to be proud, and for heaven's sakes, folks, give your board members business cards. They are your emissaries in the community. If you can't afford them, you can make them on the computer. But it gives the board member the sense that he's important to the organization, and it gives him a vehicle that he can use to prestigiously represent your organization in the community.
One of the things, we have an advantage at the Straz in that we're putting on, 600-800 shows a year. And so our board members, particularly the new board members, are invited to bring their friends free to a show. Prior to that, we have dinner for them at Maestro's, our restaurant here, show them around, show them everyone loves a backstage tour. Backstage tours are really only good when there is a play going on, because you see this mass and you're astounded that they actually are able to put it on in an effective manner. But we're sort of like Don. We have a venue that allows potential donors, friends, potential board members, to see what happens here in a rather exciting way, and it's relatively easy for us to do.
Well, gentlemen, we have gotten through 5 of the 10 items on this list. And I know there's a break coming up, and we would love to share more with you, but there is so much to know, and I hope you've gotten some great ideas from our panel about ways that you can empower your board and help maximize the effectiveness in your board. But in the few minutes that we have remaining, I'd like each of you to just sort of share for about 1 minute your thoughts, your overview on how to make your board more effective. Marty?
Well, I think going back to an earlier comment, I think it's important to really understand what's going on in the organization and what's going on around it surrounding the organization. Come up with a plan, make that plan known, make it measurable, try to get the organization aligned to that plan, and then manage your exit. Get the organization to a place where you feel very comfortable turning over to someone else and allowing that to occur in a very natural way. So just make your plan, stick to your plan.
Martin?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that one thing Don said is critical to the whole structure. Have the board members feel comfortable and a part of the active process of what's going on. As I look back on a couple board members who left, they left because they didn't feel utilized. They didn't feel utilized. They had their thoughts, and their thoughts weren't listened to. And they were very disappointed. Good donors, et cetera. They said, look, there are other organizations I would rather work for. So you have to be sure that the board member is taken care of, that you give the board member a job, the job is done, the board member is thanked, you have special treats for them as far as taking care of their needs. And I think that's where I have failed, is by not seeing this until it was too late in a couple cases.
Don?
Well, as I have said, I sort of hang my hat on the idea of enabling board members. Some of you may have been here last year when I made a presentation on a Bill of Rights for board members.
Which is on the screen, by the way.
We have that on the screen now. And so I would say to you that I believe that each one of your board members must be able to answer yes to the following questions. First, do I know why I was chosen to be a board member? Are my opinions sought and valued? Am I free to disagree? Do I feel safe asking dumb questions? Have I had an adequate orientation? Do I really understand how this organization and this board works? Do I know the backgrounds and the experiences of the other board members? Do our board members have enough personal contact with each other to facilitate working together progressively? Do I know how to relate to other board members and to the chair in a board meeting? Do I know the rules of the road? Do I receive full disclosure on the issues? Am I prepared to make decisions and have opinions? And is there a private forum where I can discuss sensitive issues? I believe if they can answer yes to these questions, you're off on a good start to having an active board, one that you can be proud of. I would simply like to say that I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and that if anything that I have said strikes a chord with anybody, I'd be happy to discuss these issues with you at another time.
I'd like to thank all three of you for spending the time. It's been a lot of fun. We have had great discussions. We wish there were more time we could share so much, but these three gentlemen represent some of the finest, involved, community citizens in this entire area. Your dedication to the nonprofits that you've served is outstanding. And on behalf of our community, I thank each of you.